The Cosmere as we know it is defined by the influence of 16 shards, remnants of one single divine being known as Adonalsium. And we have learned so much about these 16 shards over the last year. So as we wind down 2025, I figured now is the time to do a full deep dive into the 16 shards and the specific nature of their engagement across the Cosmere. This video is a big one, and it will include all of the spoilers for all of the Cosmere up until the end of the Stormlight Archive, Wind and Truth, all of the Mistborn, Eras 1 and 2, and a number of books across the Cosmere that I'll put up on the screen. So let's get into it. Roughly 10,000 years before the events of the Stormlight Archive and Mistborn and a lot of the Cosmere books, there was a divine being known as Adonalsium. And about 18 people, by my count, humans, dragons, and another race known as Shodel, came together on a planet known as Yolen and decided or conspired to kill Adonalsium and to take up a piece of that divine being's power. They did so for different reasons. Some desired power. Some seemed to do so for altruistic reasons, potentially because they thought there was something wrong with Adonalsium. They thought this was the only good option left available to them. But there's a lot that we don't know about the events that led up to the killing or the shattering of Adonalsium. What we do know is that 16 of those 18 individuals took up a piece of that power known as shards and spread to different planets across the Cosmere. And there, they had a profound influence in either creating or reshaping the life around them on those planets. They had an agreement that those 16 shards wouldn't interact with each other, that they would all operate in isolation. But as we'll get to in this video, many of those shards did not keep to that agreement. Before we get into the individual shards, I want to talk about some broader key concepts or definitions. First is that the shards were fragments of the divine being known as Adonalsium. And so they have this raw divine power, also known as investiture, that they wield, and they can infuse some of that investiture or power in the planets and the inhabitants of the planets in which they interact. Each shard has a single intent that defines them. So that's intents like honor or ruin or preservation, and that is what comprises the driving motivation of that shard. Whoever takes up a shard is known as the vessel of the shard. And what that means is that they essentially become the steward of that shard, driving or sometimes becoming prisoner to the intent of the shard. And shards aren't necessarily static. They can be combined together or they can be splintered. And in either of those two actions, it sends massive ripples or implications across the Cosmere. Originally, it seems like all 16 of the shards were roughly equal in power. But over time, that has evolved as shards have either combined, as they have splintered, or in at least one case, as shards have given up a piece of their power to the planet that they inhabit, weakening themselves in the process. And remember that the shards can be splintered, or the vessels holding the shards can be killed, but the power itself seems like it can't be destroyed. It just kind of either splinters in different forms, but it persists into perpetuity. Finally, shards aren't necessarily or their intent isn't necessarily good or evil, kind of like human forms. It's more just a driving motivation that can have at times destructive implications and then at times positive implications. Okay, so with that foundation, let's go through the 16 shards in alphabetical order. Let's start. Number 1 is ambition. And ambition is a shard whose story ends early, but leaves a massive scar across the Cosmere. Ambition is held by a vessel known as, her name is Uli Da, and that's a type of race known as a Shodel. I know I'm dropping a lot of different names here, but a type of race known as Shodel. And basically, if you see beings in the Cosmere that have 4 arms, those are usually Shodel. And at some point, After the Shattering of Adonalsium, Ulida, holding the Shard of Ambition, made her way to a planetary system known as the Threnodite system. There, for some reason, another shard known as Odium tracked her down and killed her. Their battle, which had a third shard known as Mercy present during the battle, led to Ambition's death and polluted the entire Threnodite system with kind of these dangerous after effects. These disturbances led to the creation of what's known in the Threnodite system today as the Evil, which are like kind of these shadows that can kill and have this like metaphysical instability across the planet. Ambition's death also led to the creation of what's known as the Grand Knell, which is a pulse in the cognitive realm that is used for orientation and navigation. And the biggest lesson with Ambition, I think, is the incredible after effects or the implications of shardic destruction, which persists essentially forever, even after that shard has ostensibly been killed or splintered. Number 2 is Autonomy. And Autonomy is one of the most widespread, interventionist, and dangerous shards in the Cosmere. She's held by somebody named Bavadin, who is once described as being shrewd and capable, and she spread her influence in the Cosmere through multiple avatars, so that's usually how we see her. Her main homeworld is a planet known as Taldane, but we see her avatars or her followers attack the planet of Scadrial, for example, in the Mistborn series, and we also see an avatar be influential on the planet known as First of the Sun, which we see in the novel Isles of the Emberdark. Interestingly, Autonomy's like central philosophy seems to be this idea of independence or self-determination, but ironically, I think she enforces that autonomy through manipulation, threats, and force. All of this makes her one of the greatest political powers in the Cosmere. Number 3 is Cultivation, who's held by a dragon known as Corvellium Avast. Cultivation was in a romantic relationship with another shard, Honor, and for the last 10,000 years, she's been settled on the Rasharan system, but only reluctantly. She only moved there because of the pull of her partner, Honor, who wanted to settle on the Rasharan system. And in doing so, she broke the agreement, although she's not the only one, but she broke the agreement that the other shards had, which was that they would all operate in isolation, that they wouldn't interact once the shattering had been achieved. Cultivation is a subtle shard, but that doesn't make her any less dangerous. She seems to primarily operate through proxies, that spren that she's created like the Night Watcher or the sibling on Rashar, or people like Dalinar, Lift, Taravangian that she kind of prunes and cultivates to get to whatever her end goal is. And I have a different video about her because I think she's like secretly sneakier and more dangerous than she lets on. But the kind of defining feature of her power is that she helps people grow and change, even if that's necessarily not always what they want or leads to kind of like harmful consequences for them. I'm going to talk about number 4 and number 5 together, Demotion and Dominion together, because they're kind of inextricably intertwined. These are 2 more shards that have been the victim of Odium, and honestly, these ones are probably the most egregious. Devotion was held by somebody known as Aona, who has been described as a healer, or used to be a healer, and seems to be one of the most kindly shards, with the intent that is like inspired by love and compassion and service. Dominion maybe less so. He's held by somebody known as Sky. We don't know too much more beyond that, but at some point, about 8,000 years before the events of the Stormlight Archive, Devotion and Dominion were drawn into conflict with each other by Odium, who then kind of like finished them off. All of this happened on a planet known as Cell, where the novel Elantris is set in, and their combined power fuels what's known as the Door, which is like a magic system on the planet, along with other magic systems on the planet. So even though both Devotion and Dominion their vessels at least have been killed, that power persists through these magic systems, just splintered. Number 6 is Endowment, and I think Endowment is like a secret powerhouse that we're only going to see more of. She's held by a vessel known as Edgley, tell me how to say it in the comments, who's also described as one of the more compassionate shards or vessels of the shard. An endowment's intent is basically about endowing or gifting, and on the planet that she inhabits or imbues, which is Nalthis, a planet known as Nalthis, she created the system of breaths, which is like a small packet of investiture that every human on that planet is like endowed with or gifted at birth. Her most dramatic influence is the creation on that planet of the Returned, which are individuals who have been resurrected and endowed with vast power, including the ability to heal and grant breath at the end of their lives. So I think Endowment has created a relatively elegant system of endowing, giving, and receiving investiture that is generally more stable than other systems that other shards and other planets have created. Endowment's kind of funny to me as well because we see her being a little surly, especially towards Hoid. In the epigraphs of Wind and Truth, we see her write to Hoid, where she basically is like, Hoid, like, I have a plan to tackle Odium and stay out of my way. And we don't really know too much about that plan, but I'm sure it's a good one. Number 7, Honor. And Honor is dead, or is he? Honor was held by someone named Tanavast, who is dead. Tanavast, as Honor, had relocated to the Rasharan system thousands of years ago with his partner Cultivation. And he had focused on 2 planets in particular. That's Ashen, which was eventually basically destroyed because of his conflict with Odium there. And then that's Rashar itself. And Tanavast fights Odium or Honor fights Odium, essentially until his vessel, Tanavast, is killed. Eventually, Dalinar finds Honor's power, picks it up, releases it, and then the holder of Odium at the time, Taravangian, picks it up and forms a different shard that we'll get to in a moment. Honor's got a long and somewhat tragic story, but there is a little sliver of change or hope with Honor because that power is starting to grow self-aware and really think about whether its intent is actually doing good or being hurtful. Number 8 is Invention. And oof, I think there's some like weird stuff going on with Invention. Invention is held by someone known as Chan Sokar. And all we know is that Invention has been responsible for the seeming creation of multiple planets. Invention may have also created like a bird-human hybrid of some sort that are known as Lawnarchs. And we meet one of them known as Zitzi in the novel Isles of the Emberdark. And Invention, as far as I can tell, doesn't seem to reside on any single planet. It seems like he kind of like flits around the Cosmere. And he's associated, I don't think he necessarily created it, but he's associated with this like planetary megastructure known as the Grand Apparatus. That sounds like some sort of like pretty weird, creepy place where like awful stuff happens. So Invention, wild, inventive, but not necessarily in a nice way. And I think when we finally learn more about Invention, we can expect like magic and tech blended in surprising and potentially destructive ways. Number 9, Mercy. Another mysterious shard whose name may belie something a little bit deeper or darker than what it seems at first glance. It seems that Mercy was involved in the battle where Odium killed Ambition, and her exact role is unclear. There's some speculation that she could have helped perform a Mercy killing of Ambition, but the implication is a little bit chilling. Like, Mercy may seem like a gentle shard, but her actions aren't necessarily going to be peaceful. All right, number 10, Odium, who we've talked a lot about already. The big baddie of the Cosmere right now, responsible for the deaths of Ambition, Devotion, Dominion, Honor, and would have done more if he hadn't been stopped or contained. Odium's intent is not necessarily like random cruelty. It's hatred perfected, honed, and justified. So Odium was held by someone named Race, and in that form, he was temporarily contained by Honor and Cultivation and bound to the system of Rashar, where his influence was a little bit more limited in the Cosmere. Eventually, we see Race killed, and the Shard of Odium picked up by one of the most crafty people in the Cosmere known as Taravangian, and Taravangian eventually finds Honor, picks that up as well, and creates the Shard of Retribution. That's Honor and Odium combined. By the end of Wind and Truth, Retribution is freed from Rashar and free to wreak havoc across the Cosmere. So lots more to follow, I'm sure. because Retribution and Teravangian don't just want to rule the Cosmere, he wants to be the only god left. Number 11 and 12, I'm also going to talk about together. That's Preservation and Ruin, both of whom settled on the planet known as Scadrial, where the events of Mistborn are set. For most of its history, Preservation has been held by somebody known as Laras, and the magic system associated with Preservation is known as Allomancy, which kind of reflects its intent, I think, a little bit, like stability but through controlled bursts of power. For most of Ruin's history, it's held by somebody named as Ati, and Ati is somebody that seems like basically seemingly the opposite of the Shard Ruin. He's often described as somebody that was kindly and took up the destructive Shard of Ruin kind of as an act of self-sacrifice. Ruin's magic system is known as Hemalurgy, which is kind of all about taking elements from another person, ripping and repurposing. Preservation and Ruin together created the planet Scadrial, and they created the people and the humans inhabiting that planet. So unlike most other humans in the Cosmere, the people on Scadrial are directly created by those two shards. And in doing so, Preservation gave up a piece of his power, and so ended up becoming overall slightly weaker than Ruin. Eventually, for reasons that I won't get into here, but eventually, Ruin and Preservation are both taken up by a single individual known as Szed, forming the Shard of Harmony. And I want to talk about Harmony for a second, held by, as I mentioned, good guy Szed, a terraceman from Scadrial. Harmony becomes one of the most powerful shards in the Cosmere, uniquely positioned to guide Scadrial and potentially the wider Cosmere. But duality has its problems because Preservation and Ruin, as kind of two, not entirely opposite, but kind of two intents that are at tension with each other, kind of lead to inaction from our Harmony. He's kind of like pulled in two different directions, and as a result, somewhat paralyzed. I am certain that Harmony will eventually turn into discord, and that's because the Ruin side of Harmony will eventually win out over Preservation, and Harmony, I think, will go from this benevolent shard to something much more destructive in the Cosmere. Number 13 is the Shard of Reason, and we know very little. This is like the latest shard that we learned about. We know very little about Reason. What we do know, it's held by somebody known as Eurydius, and at some point in the future, the shard seems to have vanished. The fact that Reason is missing doesn't seem to reflect its importance. I think Reason is probably missing for a reason. So I think it's likely that Reason plays a major role in the Cosmere, especially as magic and technology and logic kind of all combine. Number 14, Valor, another missing shard. Valor is held by a dragon god known as Medalantorius, and we know she's hiding. There are hints of tragedy with Valor, seemingly wrapped up with her relationship with Hoid. There's definitely something going on there, and I think there are hints that they had like some sort of a romantic relationship in the past, but with some sort of tragedy associated with it. At one point, Harmony writes to Hoid that Valor told him that it's been too long since they last connected and Hoid should seek her out, which is the entire opposite of what Endowment says to Hoid, where she says, like, it's not been too long, Valor doesn't want to see you, stay away. So I don't know which one is true. What I do know is at the end of Mistborn Era 2, Hoid kind of resolves to find Valor, and I think it's entirely likely that he does find her and reconnects with her. So yeah, Valor, weird one, lots more to learn there. Number 15 is Virtuosity. Virtuosity is one of the most seemingly creative shards as someone that rewards creativity, and one of the only shards that we know that has purposely splintered or killed herself. Virtuosity is associated with a planet known as Komashi. That's the planet where the novel Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is set on, and her investiture manifests itself as these spirits known as Hio. And I think what Virtuosity really shows us is that despite splintering, a shard can still reshape a world and still maybe undo that splintering. And finally, number 16 is Whimsy. And oh man, like, we don't know the vessel, we don't know where Whimsy is, we know basically nothing here. Whimsy is probably one of the most unpredictable of like the wild cards of the Cosmere, and a world ruled by Whimsy I think could be like surreal and incredibly chaotic. But we will meet Whimsy eventually, I'm sure, and it will be bizarre. Okay, so we've explored the shards, their vessels, their legacies, the planets that they inhabit. But the Cosmere is entering a new age, and there's a new kind of shift in the balance of power as these different shards have imbued their own planets and made their own moves. So I want to think through what that kind of future would look like. The first theme here, I think, is a possible alliance between Retribution, that's the fusion of Honor and Odium, and an alliance with Autonomy. Their intents are complementary. Retribution enforces authority, punishes betrayal, I think, and wields like raw power. Autonomy kind of does so too, but in her own way. She sort of kind of like enforces autonomy and expects mortals or people to serve her goals. And I think there are hints that they're already collaborating. At the end of Wind and Truth, Retribution makes a note to himself that he wants to divert the other shards' attention away from Roshar towards Scadrial. And shortly afterwards, Autonomy attacks Scadrial. So, coincidence? I think not. It's a scary prospect because these are two crafty and dangerous shards and vessels as well. So their powers combined or allied is a pretty scary proposition for the Cosmere. The second theme that I think we can expect to see is harmony turning into discord as the Ruin side grows stronger. But I think the way that Sazed, the vessel of harmony, may react to this is by splintering Discord to remove or at least weaken his influence or Discord's influence across the Cosmere. So we may actually see harmony or Discord taken off the table as kind of a strategic sacrifice to mitigate kind of the damage that harmony/discord might wreak. With Retribution and Autonomy in motion, and harmony potentially like removing himself from the equation, I think it's interesting to think about like what other sharded coalitions might come into play here to counterbalance these developments. One obvious one, I think, is potentially a coalition between Endowment and Valor and potentially Reason as well. And Endowment has already claimed in her letters to Hoy that she has dealings with Valor, potentially as part of the her plan to combat Odium. And these three shards, I think, coming together, to me seem like the most logical coalition as a counterbalance to Retribution and Autonomy. Another coalition that's like kind of fun to think about is a coalition between Reason and Invention. They're a combination of like logic and creativity, could lead to like the combination of like magic and tech that I think like could really like rival whatever Retribution or Autonomy can come up with. So it could be like a wild card here. And then another wild card is Whimsy, honestly. Or Whimsy and Invention, which honestly could just be like sheer chaos, just like coming up with like crazy random stuff that like completely waylays the like carefully laid plans or planning processes that we know both Retribution and Autonomy thrive under. So yeah, all of this to say is that the Cosmere isn't just like a collection of individual shards. It's like this cosmic game of combinations and strategic alliances. And the next era promises like a lot more shardic drama. So hopefully this was helpful. And if you like this kind of content, like please watch. I have a number of other videos on all things Cosmere. And please like and subscribe. And